And we always had that debate about value versus values. And I think we still do today. Ultimately, we need to create value. We need to make money for our investors, and we need to make money for us as a business. But we also wanted to stick to our core values. But co-living is much smaller studio homes. Our view at Hub is it's a subsector of built to rent. People would disagree with that, but it is studio built to rent. One of the kind of risks to co-living right now today is everyone's a co-living developer because it's viable. And we've got to be really careful because we're finally at a point in the UK, particularly in London, where co-living is seen as a positive. I did get asked recently on a panel session if I was Angela Rayner for one day, what would it change? Obviously I had a long list, but just to focus on one.
Welcome back to the People Property Place podcast. Today I'm joined by Damien Sharkey. Welcome to the pod.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Not at all. Well, look, I'm really excited to unpack a little bit about your background and experience and how you've kind of navigated your career to date within this phenomenal development world. But before we get on to unpacking Hub and the particular route that you have kind of taken to get to where you are today, can you tell me a little bit about how and why you got into real estate in the first place?
Yes, of course. I think I'll have to go back to my childhood in rural Ireland. I was brought up, raised in a family of tradespeople. So my family of joiners, plumbers, electricians, bricklayers, general builders. So I was always surrounded by that kind of team of people who could build anything. And from a young child, I loved it. I just loved building. I loved watching them. I wanted to be able to do it from a very young age. But I was obsessed with how things came together, how we built things. My father had a joinery workshop growing up. So he had a joinery business. He made windows, doors, stairs, kitchens. And I was working in that workshop as an 11-year-old in the summers. And it wasn't just pretending to work. My father had very kind of strict rules about work ethic. And actually his golden rule growing up was work ethic was everything. If you have good work ethic, you will succeed in life. And he taught myself and my twin brother that in abundance. So that experience of being an 11-year-old working in the workshop and then going out in the evenings and going out at weekends with my father to measure windows, doors, stairs. I'm still amazed today how he could go out to a house with a measuring tape, measure a really complex set of stairs, draw it on a little notebook, take it back to the joinery workshop and then build it. I'm still amazed.
And come up with a quote that was accurate, that enabled enough, fat and profit in there for him to make a living too, right?
Exactly. It was just admiration for what he could do. My father didn't have the education I had. He didn't have anywhere near the opportunities I had, but he was still able to go and do that. And that love for what he did, that respect for what he did, but also admiration got me really obsessed more in design. And then I started to draw. And I was like, I want to be able to draw these beautiful houses. I want to be able to deliver these houses, but I also wanted to be able to build them at that age. So myself and my twin brother both decided, despite our destiny was to work in our father's joinery workshop, because that was you followed your parents. And my parents did have a successful business. So we decided at 14, we're like, maybe we should try something else. And my parents were like, yes, let's break tradition. You don't have to go into the family business. You could do something else. So we both decided to work very hard at school. And then we got a little bit of competitive tension. We did well on our GCSEs. And then we got a little bit obsessed with it towards A levels. And we ended up in the national newspaper as 18-year-olds for getting some of the highest points in the whole of Ireland. So all of a sudden there was the journalists and photographers there taking our photographs. Our parents were extremely proud. And they're like, what are you going to do next? And we're like, we don't know. We were so obsessed with doing well at school to get an opportunity to do something other than go into the family business. We didn't know what to do.
You hadn't even thought that far ahead.
We hadn't even thought. It was like both of us were very much in competition. I wanted to be first, but I wanted him to be second. He wanted to be first and he wanted me to be second. So that competitive spirit drove us on. And we ended up taking a year. Both of us took a year out and we went back to the joinery workshop. And we worked there 6 days a week, no holidays. That work ethic again instilled in us. But what our parents' blessing, we took the year as an opportunity to discover what we actually wanted to do.
On the one day off you had.
On the one day off. But also my father worked with lots of architects and architectural technicians. And just seeing quite often my father's frustration with the drawings they produced and him having to solve the problems. Both my brother and I were really interested in it. We're also interested in going into a career in development, construction, design. And our view at that point was the architect was a lead professional. It was more, our view of the architect at that stage in our lives was the architect controlled the design, controlled the build. They were head of the table.
They were on site.
They were on site. It was more
pulling the strings across.
Exactly.
Everything.
It was more the traditional role of an architect. And where we're from in Ireland, architects did have that control, although on much smaller scale than going to the big towns or cities. So we both decided to pursue a career in architecture, but we both decided to go to different universities.
So who actually came first and who came second?
My brother came first, and then it was very close. But my brother did come first. My brother was he was unbelievable. Well, he still is, but he was unbelievably gifted. He was also very gifted at making stairs. I think out of the two of us, if one of us was going to follow my father's footsteps, it was probably more my brother Declan. But yes, we both decided to study architecture, but go to different universities. I ended up at University of Ulster in Belfast, and he ended up at Queen's University in Belfast. But we had that competitive spirit. We both ended up with first-class degrees. We both ended up with the top marks in our year. We both ended up with very good job opportunities again. But we both started to question, should we revert back to the joinery workshop again? But thankfully, again, with parents' blessing, we both came to London. I got offered a job at Terry Farrell and Partners, so now known as Farrell's. And I was very fortunate to be selected as one of the Part 1 students at the time to work directly for Terry Farrell. It was also a bit daunting because, he was a very famous architect. He delivered amazing buildings. It was a big team. They were internationally renowned. But I was selected as the one to work with him directly on his ideas for islands on the Thames estuary, which eventually, you'll probably recall, Boris Johnson decided he would like to put an airport there. So my first role as a Part 1 architect in London was colouring in Terry Farrell's plans. But that experience of working for such a kind of world-renowned architect at the time was amazing. But I also wanted some practical experience. So I was asking my line managers and various project architects there, could I get experience of building buildings? Because the university experience was good, but I always struggled with it still being very conceptual. I'm very practical, given my background. I entered architecture to be able to build beautiful buildings, but not just design. I wanted to build them. So I ended up getting experience at Farrell's of working on a scheme in Regent's Place in London and getting exposure to clients. This was my first real exposure to developers, investors, and funders. And at that age, I was very interested in how do you bring all these elements together to realize a 30-story tower or whatever it may be. But myself and my brother also decided we wanted to have our own little development company. So back in the good old days when we could get 100% mortgages, we both decided to buy property. So we bought little flats and we renovated them on the weekends ourselves. Got some help from family. And again, that experience of understanding how debt worked, understanding a little bit of procurement, understanding the rental market, again, got me very interested in, is there another career other than just architecture? But I was very blessed. Farrell sponsored me to do my Part 2. So I went to Cardiff, did my Part 2, again with my brother. We both did our Part 2 together. Very competitive again. So after finishing in Cardiff, I came out of university to absolute chaos. It was in 2008-9. I went into university. The world was booming. Everyone was employing. I got my fees. I got sponsorship. I came back and there wasn't really a job for me. So it was witnessing that chaos in about 10, 11 months was so shocking and surprising to see how the industry and market had changed in such a short period of time. But I came back to Farrell's it was a very different environment at the time. There's lots of redundancies. I was fortunate that I had my job, but I thought that was an opportunity to maybe try something different. And a friend of mine told me that Robin Partington was setting up his own business. So Robin Partington was at Foster's, very heavily involved in the design of the Gherkin. And then he went to Hamilton's, so he's very involved in many of the kind of iconic buildings across London that are delivered today. So he was setting up his own business. I went to meet him. There's only 2 people in the office. They had monitors on cardboard boxes in a temporary office. But it was really exciting hearing his vision for the business, his view of how a business should be run, but also his view on how you treat staff and his ambition to have an employee-owned trust, even at the very beginning of his business. He's very clear. He didn't want his name above the door forever. He wanted a team who really bought into the business. So I joined there as, I think, employee number 4 or 5. And
despite the world
falling apart, Robin Partington used that as an opportunity to set up his own business. And he had very good backing from some amazing clients like Lendlease. And they backed Robin with 2 or 3 projects.
Which gave you the work and the confidence that you could change jobs and
exactly
still get paid.
And it was also an opportunity for me to step up a little bit. But by joining early, I seen it as an opportunity to grow with the business. And within 2 years, we went from 5 people to 50 people. So
Wow.
It was rapid growth. And it was doing architecture, I'll say in a slightly different way, but more importantly to me was how the business was run. So I was very fortunate to grow with the business. I completed my Part 3 in architecture at Westminster. But when Robin started to implement the employee-owned trust, there was someone from the team he was going to select as an executive director to represent the staff. And I always remember I went into the office, I always go in early, I work very hard. And he came to me and asked me, would I be an executive director? I was 24 years old. I was like, really? An executive? That sounds important. But I was really honored. So I was put on the board at 24, 25 years old. But I was put on the board to represent our young team we had at the time. And I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed getting insight to the business cash flow, where the risks were, where the opportunities were, dealing with HR, understanding the intricacies of a really successful business, what works and what doesn't. But through that experience, I still had an itch to go and work developer side. At this point, I was in meetings with Ballymore, European land, British land, and just looking in awe at these development directors, managing directors, CEOs. I was like, I want to do that. And I didn't want to replicate what they did, but there was an itch to go and have a little bit more power, a little bit more control, and really kind of not just focus solely on design. So at Robin's blessing, I went off, spoke to a number of recruitment agents.
So you told him what your plan was?
I told Robin what my plan was, because Robin gave me an amazing opportunity initially to join, but more importantly, as an executive director, to have that in my CV at such a young age. And to witness how a business is set up and how it's run. Like, it's not often as a young, newly qualified architect you would get that insight and that exposure. He backed me, so I felt I had to tell him about what I was going to do. So
And did he take it well?
I took it extremely well, to the point where
he'd seen the writing on the wall, right?
I think so. He probably knew it was always something I wanted to do. But to the point he wrote my reference before I had a job. And to this day, I've never seen such positive things down in paper about me. So it was very flattering. And he did back me. So I went out and I spoke to a number of developers. I was really fortunate. I got offered 2 or 3 opportunities. And I think at the time there was a view that good architects with a commercial mind that understands business can make a good developer. I still have that view today. I'm sure we'll come to it later. But I went through an interview process with Argent, Essential Living, other developers. But I met Hub. I was introduced to Hub. And Hub was a business at the time, didn't have a website. It was just set up. And I was fortunate enough to have a meeting with Robert Sloss and Tim Barlow, who are the two of the three co-founders of the business. And I just really liked their vision. I liked them as people. I liked Robert's entrepreneurial kind of mindset, what he stood for, what the business stood for. But they had two sides and a great vision and some great backing. So I had a second interview, and a bit like when I joined Robin Partington, I remember discussing it with my girlfriend, now my wife at the time, and it was like, if I go there, I can be part of determine apart the future of Hub to an extent. I'll be part of that journey. A little bit like at Robin Partington, I ended up as executive director and on the board at 24. Kind of repeat that in development. So I decided to join Hub. Best decision I ever made. So I joined Hub.
So before we get on to that, just rewinding. So kind of the story is like wanted to build things, really practical, grew up with a family of tradesmen, women. And that was your kind of route into property fundamentally. Yeah. And then as you went through that process and doubled down on your academic experience, kind of understood through being a cabinet maker and joiner effectively that the architects kind of called the shot, and that opened up your eyes to this bigger picture of real estate, pursued that, and then through that gateway realised that actually, how it's funded, developed, delivered, occupied, monetized, etc. There's this other bigger world of development. And so it was kind of that third iteration of being really curious that basically got you to the point of going, actually, development is actually what I want to do and where I want to pursue my career.
Exactly, perfectly summarized.
Which I think the reason why I wanted to break it down like that is because I think there's been a number of people who've been on this podcast who get into real estate through architecture because they like drawing buildings, or their parents have bought a couple of buy-to-let flats and have done well, or they look around and, a friend of a friend who's quite wealthy has, bought a property, developed it and flipped it and made some, and they think that is the route rather than through development or finance or debt or capital raising or whatever other route, the more institutional grade space come. And so that's why I just wanted to kind of break it down, because you spent a number of years going on that journey of curiosity to find the part of the market that you wanted to land in.
I think curiosity is a really good way of describing it. I'd say I was always destined to end in a development role. Just because of, from being an 11-year-old in the joinery workshop to being obsessed with being successful at school, to being competitive with my brother, to deciding to study architecture, to having my own little property portfolio with my brother. It was that all of those steps along the way ultimately influenced my decision to I want to pursue a career in development. And it was to have that understanding of the full cycle. And it probably goes back to being a child and understanding how on earth did my father measure and then ultimately build and ultimately install that staircase. I wanted that deep understanding of the development cycle, which is a big ask given how broad development is. But I quite like the fact my route into development hasn't been the traditional route. It hasn't been, no disrespect, but I haven't gone to Reading. I haven't done that course and ended up in development. It's a very kind of mixed background from joinery to architecture. But it's a route that I think more and more developers are seeing as one, you don't have to come into development through the traditional route. And quite often you end up getting people from diverse backgrounds that make really good developers and think slightly different to potentially the traditional role of a development manager.
So you had the architecture level 1, 2 and 3, but crucially, which is unique probably to you over maybe others in their early 20s, is you had the kind of the business acumen, exposure, or inside look in terms of like what the playbook is and actually how the business operates and runs, rather than, not having that.
Yeah.
So that's a unique skill set to have. If we think about your wider development management skill set, where do you think the holes were at that particular stage in terms of trying to transition to be a developer?
Very good question. Where the holes were was understanding the financial side of what we do. And I remember my first interview with Robert and Tim. I was very, very clear. When I come into the business, I was joining in a junior role, assistant development manager, but I was very clear, if you give me an appraisal to run, I'm going to mess it up. It's not my strong point. I understood numbers, I understood business from working with Robin Partington and my own little property portfolio, but I'm not going to be able to run a really detailed appraisal day one. So that was a big gap. I would say, without wanting to sound arrogant, I probably thought I knew more about development than I did. When I went in there, I understood the design, understood planning, understood construction. But when it comes to debt, finance, operations, funding, returns, that was all like new to me. But I embraced it and I absolutely loved it. My view was, no headphones in the office. I want to hear everything that's said. If I don't understand what that acronym is, because we have so many, I'd write it down in my notebook and I would ask someone at the end of the day or Google it. Because I just really wanted to understand that quickly. But I think, I was fortunate at Hub. They had the patience. They let me grow. But not just at Hub. We had JV partners like Bridges Fund Management who embraced me from a very young age. And I think being in an environment where people are supportive, people are driven, people are ambitious, but ultimately the people are nice. I know that sounds such a simple thing to say, but when you change career, and it is daunting, and there was days I asked myself, what on earth am I doing? You need to be surrounded by nice people. You need to be surrounded by smart people and patient people. Very fortunate at Hub from those early days to where they are today. I think is Hub still very much values young, raw talent, and then taking that talent and merging that into an existing team, and which ultimately results in a really good team player, but someone who's really good at their job.
The thing that kind of stands out for me with that, and just trying to think of someone who's maybe on a similar journey right now, is clearly you're self-aware enough in terms of where your strengths were and what you knew, but also what you didn't know. And to a point, maybe you thought you knew more than you actually did. Take that out. But what I quite like is just the openness to say, look, I've clearly got a bucket load of drive. I've proved that over multiple different iterations earlier on in my career or personal life, and just wanting to be really, really hungry. And it's having the strong behavioral attributes and backing yourself that you'll learn the technical attributes, and bringing both of those together will create a really strong, compelling, strong skill set and a capable development manager. And so maybe someone listening to this who's earlier on in the journey, who wants to pivot or change, but doesn't have all the skills or is struggling to think about how they can compete with someone who's already ready-made or out of the box ready to do it, probably doubling down on more of the behavioral attributes.
I completely agree with that. I think it's more about the person's work ethic. It's more about, are they hungry to succeed? Quite often the opposite's a problem when someone's ready-made. We don't want ready-made people. We want people to come in and we can mold, direct them, and turn them into someone that is going to be a successful development manager. Every development manager that I work with have different strengths and weaknesses. You don't get two development managers that are the same because the role is so wide. Like, you are a jack of all trades and a master of none quite often, but you've got to know enough about everything. And at certain points on your project, you've got to know more about a certain aspect. And then 6 months go by and it's something else. And I think you've got to have that, entrepreneurial skill set. I think that's very important as well. You've got to be driven. You've got to have a passion for real estate. I think a work ethic and a passion for real estate means you'll be successful in this industry. And we're interviewing people at the minute, and I quite often get asked about my career, and I get asked what makes a good development manager. I get asked why am I successful in development? I go back to the basics. It goes back to we want to employ someone with a strong work ethic, someone who's passionate about real estate, and someone who's smart. We can give them the rest of the tools of those three core ingredients.
So you joined Hub as the fourth employee?
Number 4 within Hub, yes.
And you had 2 projects at that stage, backing with Bridges Fund Management, but no website?
Well, at the time, so Hub had 2 sites. One was bought from NAMA and one was bought from a family who didn't like estate agents in West London. And they were the first 2 sites. Then when I joined, we acquired 2 additional sites within 3 or 4 months after joining, and they were backed by Bridges Fund Management.
And tell me about the sites or the projects or what you're going to fundamentally turn them into.
Yeah, so joining at the beginning, there was a small team, but a little bit like joining Robin Partington day one, I was exposed to everything. And a day in the life of a young assistant development manager, I always describe, I think it was my first month in the business, we had, in one of those sites, we had someone illegally dumped 40 skips. So I had to go and meet that person, talk to the police, talk to the insurer. On the same day, I'm in a room talking to our JV partner and investor, and it's a really good example of how wide the role is, and you've got to be able to do it all, and you've got to be able to adjust how you operate for those situations to get the result you ultimately want. But our first, I'll talk about our first 4 projects because it's quite an interesting group of projects. Our first acquisition was a site in the Royal Docks. We bought the site from NAMA, and we ended up getting consent for 360 homes. We ended up forward selling the homes. The market's not there for that sort of exit today, but it was at the time. And in our second site, which is, I think, a really key moment in the growth of Hub, we bought a site with consent, but it was a really poor consent. So we reworked the consent through multiple Section 96As. And we ended up with a deliverable scheme. But at the time, there was lots of talk about institutional funding and PRS. So BTR didn't exist back then, it was PRS. And we ended up doing the UK's first institutional forward funding deal on rehearsal rooms in North Acton.
With M&G?
With M&G Real Estate, yes. So we did that with Alex Greaves.
And Freddie, no doubt.
Well, at the time it was Steve Hollins, who's now at PIC. So it was Alex and Steve we did the deal with. But we were all learning, including Ealing Council, including the GLA, because this was the first ever Section 106 that needed to have affordable housing that was some sort of rental product. So the discount market rent product.
As a percentage of the total units that you were looking.
And discount, how is it managed? How is it controlled? Not today. Today it's very clear there's policy set out. At that time we were, to an extent, writing our own policy along with Ealing, along with the GLA. So that was a pivotal moment in the growth of Hub. We did that deal. We ultimately built that scheme out and we became institutionally acceptable. So it's a very, very critical moment.
And that was in 2000 and...
That was 2000. We did that deal in 2000, started negotiating in 2013 and concluded it in 2014.
And that was right at the genesis of the UK institutional market. I've had a couple of people on the podcast before who we've spoken about Granger being the kind of the only real kind of institutional UK landlord of scale in the residential space, and most people would want to kind of pursue a career more on the commercial side of real estate in kind of office, retail or industrial logistics, and residential was seen as kind of a second-rate citizen almost, right? So this was right at the emergence of the UK institutional residential market.
Exactly. This was the point where everyone's like, there's this great thing called multifamily in the States. Shall we do it here in the UK? And obviously, like any new asset class, we start in London. So we were one of the first into that sector. And very quickly, so that was our first 2 sites, but our first 2 sites with Bridges Fund Management was Chesterfield House in Wembley. So we stepped in. It was a distressed asset. We actually exchanged within 3 weeks of putting it under offer. And then a scheme in the old vinyl factory. We bought 2 plots from Cathedral and DevSec, now you and I. So we acquired 2 plots there. And both of those schemes were my first kind of real projects to have ownership within Hub. So we had to work through planning, very difficult planning journey in Wembley, given it was 26-story building and it was surrounded by buildings of kind of 5 and 6 stories. But interestingly, at the conclusion of those planning journeys, The institutional forward funding market was maturing. There was more deals happening. And we ended up forward funding our material store scheme in Hayes to Fizzy Living, backed by Adia. So we did that with Harry Downs at the time. And Adam Russell was there before he went to Legal and General. So that was very much our kind of second deal, still finding our way. But it was an amazing way to exit 189 units. And we ended up selling 54 on the market in a separate block. But again, it de-risked the project. We were able to get on and deliver it. It's a very successful scheme, now owned by Greystar. And then in Chesterfield House, we had a difficult planning journey. Viability was very challenging on it. But we ended up forward funding that with Railstar and Quadrail. I know you had Ryan on a number of weeks ago, so we've done a number of deals with Ryan and Kate at Railstar. But again, that was our third institutional forward funding deal. So by now we were very much, these guys know what they're doing. They can do it. But also we were starting to get a deeper understanding of what this multifamily rental product was. When we started at rehearsal rooms, it was a market sale product, and you take out a 3-bedroom flat and you put in a party room or a function room. That was the amenity. Clearly that was first gen built to rent. I'd say as we started to go towards the uncle buildings and later on with Get Living and so on, we moved into kind of second generation built to rent. Built to rent became the new buzzword. It was BTR now. But we were able to actually really refine our product, understand what the market wanted, use a lot of data and research to influence what we were designing. And we were designing schemes from day one that we were able to build and institutional funders were mostly happy with. Of course, they're always going to make changes. So we ended up delivering both the scheme in Hayes and the scheme in Wembley. And at that point, it was like, where do we go next? And we went back to our roots at Hub and we looked at kind of mid-market build to rent. Because at the time there was a rapid move towards kind of, heavily amenitized, the amenity arms race. It was all about size, bigger amenity, bigger flats, which ultimately ended up in higher rents. Whereas at Hub, we went a little bit back to our roots and we're like, hold on a second. We set up this business for mid-market housing, for sale and for rent. So we started looking at outside of London. And we were very fortunate to be selected by Smedvig as a development partner for a large regen site in Maidenhead. So it's 25% of Maidenhead town centre. And we reworked that scheme. So it was 429 built to rent homes. That was bold and brave because lots of institutional funders are like, we're not going to Maidenhead. Crossrail's coming in, but it's not London. But one of the positives that came out of COVID was the resilience of the living sector. And there was this bounce immediately after COVID where lots of institutional funders realized, my homes are 99% occupied, my rent's at 99%. This is a resilient sector. And we were immediately approached about a lot of our schemes at that point. And off the back of that, Get Living made the decision to look at kind of outer London, built to rent, multifamily, but in really well-connected locations, very much aligning what we thought 2 or 3 years earlier. So we ended up forward funding 429 homes for 155 million to Get Living. That was a big statement. That was our biggest single forward funding deal. It was very much a mid-market product. We got it on site within 3 months. JJ Rattigan's built it. We built 429 homes in 29 months. It was a project that went really well. But it went really well. We had a great partner in Get Living, a great contractor in JJ Rattigan's, and a great JV partner in Smedvig. But at that point we were in flow. We decided, so we've now looked at outside of London. What's next? And we were like, we need to look at cities outside of London, but we wanted to focus on lifestyle cities. And what we mean by lifestyle cities is cities people want to live in, good transport, good amenity, good job offers, good student retention. So we identified Edinburgh, Leeds, Birmingham, and then we had Bath and Bristol as kind of one location. And we acquired, again, that kind of post-COVID, we acquired a large site in Leeds. One site had consent, the other site had consent for an office building. But 6 months after acquiring it, we had forward funded phase 1 to Railstar and Quadrail again, funding 63 homes. And we placed the building contract with CISC. So we de-risked that on site. Within 12 months of buying it, we had consent for another 488 homes on the adjoining site. Forward funded that with Railstar Quadrail. So within 4.5 years on that project, we'll have delivered 951 homes. So that is like a sign of how positive the BTR sector can be for the delivery of housing and that institutional funding model. But we were in our stride. As you can see, we'd done our 12th institutional forward funding deal. It was deal after deal. We were exiting these deals. Things were going well. And then, of course, we have the war in Ukraine. We have Trustonomics. We have a number of events that starts to change the funding market, change viability, obviously debt, yields move. But one thing we're really good at Hub is responding to market conditions. I think one of the advantages of being a privately owned business is we are able to change direction. Not change direction for the sake of it, but change direction because we need to. And what I mean by changing direction is looking at, the flexibility in how we exit our deals. So if you can't exit a deal through our traditional forward funding route, we've got to look at alternatives. Is it structured funding? Is it joint ventures? Is it build and hold? So we started to look at deals in different ways, but we also started to look at other asset classes within the living sector. And we started to talk a lot more and look a lot more co-living. Co-living was talked a lot about. We had one co-living scheme. At the time, we were doing lots of research on how to change the perception of co-living. Because it's fair to say the first generation of co-living was very impressive what was achieved, but lots of local authorities were quite cynical about it. And lots of investors also were like, no, this hasn't got a future. So we tried to turn that on its head, lots of convincing with the GLA. Our first scheme was Hammersmith and Fulham. It was a really tough planning journey, but we ended up getting consent for what I would say was second generation co-living at the time.
Property is a people business, hence the name People Property Place. Business has been tough the last couple of years. Get the people aspect wrong, business becomes impossible. Get the people aspect right, it's still hard, but it's manageable, much more enjoyable, and you're much more likely to hit your goals. So if you're looking to add top talent to your team in 2025 and you're open-minded to an alternative approach and you're keen to make business a little less hard, drop me a DM. I'd love to have a conversation with you to see how Rockborn could potentially help you with your human capital requirements. Right, let's get back to the podcast. Can you just explain for people listening, what is the difference between the kind of the PRS, private rented sector, that's kind of switched to, what is now known as the BTR kind of product? We've spoken about the amenity race as well. Can you just talk about the difference between BTR, as it is known now, and co-living as a kind of a living product?
Sure. So BTR multifamilies, traditional C3 housing, it's 1, 2s and 3 beds. Shared amenity. The quantum of that amenity, how much amenity we should provide is still questionable. But co-living is much smaller studio homes. Our view at Hub is it's a subsector of built to rent. People would disagree with that, but it is studio built to rent. So in co-living, we'll have 25 square meter studios, still have small living areas, bedroom area, bathroom, and then we'll have 4 to 5 square meters per studio of shared amenity. So we'll have dining areas, kitchens, co-working, gym, wellness, TV. So rooms will have the amenity that we're encouraging people to use those spaces and share them. But one of the things we were very keen on from day one is these were still homes. They weren't rooms. I think there's a very important difference between a room and a home. And we didn't want to deliver co-living schemes that felt like hotels. We wanted to deliver co-living schemes that felt like homes. And that's why the size of the studio was important. So if someone didn't want to go and cook next to their neighbor, or they didn't want to go and work in the co-working, there was an ability within these studios for them to live an independent life, but also they had the choice to go and use this amenity space.
So what, you'd rob a bit of amenity space and make the room slightly bigger than like what the traditional...
What we did, I talked about first generation co-living. We're looking at that first generation.
It's like the collective, right?
Yeah, they were rooms. They were 12 to 16 square meters. We probably see kind of second generation being 18 to 20. We're very much 23 to 25 for the very point I made about the quality of a person's life living in these studios. But we don't compromise on the amenity. So we do end up with bigger studios and the same quantum of amenity.
But it's still smaller than a BTR.
It's smaller than BTR, yes. And one of the kind of risks to co-living right now today is everyone's a co-living developer because it's viable. And we've got to be really careful because we're finally at a point in the UK, particularly in London, where co-living is seen as a positive. More and more local authorities are accepting it as an asset class. They're seeing it as part of the solution to the housing crisis. They're seeing it as an enabler to deliver affordable housing and an enabler to deliver greater good in communities and also, importantly, deliver housing, which we're struggling with traditional C3 at the minute. We've got to be very careful as a sector. We don't just say everything's co-living because at Hub, we don't think that. We think co-living works in the right location, in the right place. And, the schemes, co-living would probably be financially more rewarding for us, but we're not doing co-living because we don't feel it's appropriate for those locations. So we've been involved in the emergence and growth of that co-living sector as we've continued with our multifamily strategy. And we call them strategies at Hub because just reverting back to that, kind of post-start of the war, post-Trustonomics, the multifamily slowing down, the growth of our co-living strategy was one that really kind of for a year or two became 60-70% of what we were doing within the business. But alongside that, we started to look at what's next, in the strategy, and we had an idea about what we would call stranded assets or end of life buildings. So we looked at kind of there's three issues in our real estate sector. We had a housing crisis. Clearly, there's not enough housing. We had a climate emergency, but we also had lots of empty office buildings, no longer fit for purpose, but in amazing locations and town and city centres all over the UK. So what was going to happen to these buildings? Potentially, they're going to be knocked down. New offices built, but we didn't probably need as much office buildings. So we came up with the idea of how about we buy these stranded buildings, end-of-life buildings, but look at ultra-urban locations. So really, really good locations. And we started looking at the City of London.
With a view that building could be an office, but it's probably not the best location, or the building next door or a few down is actually going to be the best in class.
Exactly.
Flexible, highly amenitized office that will win that battle. But still, there is a need for people who are going to want to live and have proximity to their workplace who want to be right here.
Exactly. We wanted to look at areas, the building is not going to be competitive with the neighbouring buildings, best in class office uses. So we came up with the strategy of looking at co-living because these locations also tended to lend themselves to co-living being an appropriate use for those areas. And you look at the City of London, and when I talk about the City of London, I'm talking about the residential zones within the city. So those areas appropriate for living. And it's just giving people the opportunity to live in those locations that they otherwise wouldn't be able to. But also co-living by its very nature is more affordable with a small a. It's typically 7 to 10% cheaper than a traditional studio multifamily flat when you consider all bills being included. So the City of London liked it as a concept, but in the right location. But finding the appropriate building was extremely hard. And our acquisition team probably looked at 40 to 50 buildings to find our first. And that's because we're not going down the permitted development route.
Yeah, so what's the difference between PD or permitted development and going down the co-living kind of planning play? So
we decided day one not to restrict ourselves to permitted development.
And can you just explain what the difference is?
Well, in our case, we're submitting a whole new planning application. So we're not going down permitted development. They would say if you do A, B, C, and D, you've got your consent.
And you can change it from an office to residential dwelling.
Yeah. In certain locations. For instance, the locations we're in the city, we couldn't do permitted development anyway. But we have never looked at permitted development. Others do. But we're ultimately worried about the quality at the end. Because what the strategy, we want the homes to feel like they're new homes. So although we're keeping the existing structure, we're keeping the frame, we'll try and retain the facade, retain the foundations. Our goal is when these are finished, when a tenant ultimately takes the keys, moves into one of these homes, they're not compromised. They don't have random structure running through the middle of it. They don't have tiny windows. They don't look onto a gable end nearby. They're still exemplar housing, exemplar homes. So that's why we didn't just restrict ourselves to permitted development.
Whereas on the PD side, you had to go through all the different checkboxes and you're almost retrospectively creating a product to fit that particular asset, hence why it could just be funky shaped or
you're back
a bit
solving. You end up with maybe dog-legged homes and so on. That wasn't, we wanted rational homes, we wanted efficient buildings, and we wanted good floor to ceiling, high quality, good daylighting. So by having to work up, despite the fact it was converting a building, we still had to go through all the same requirements, rules and regulations as a new build. But that strategy was one that served us extremely well. We've now got 3 existing buildings, 2 in the city. One we acquired 10 days ago in Suddock, on Suddock Bridge Road. And those are all part of our kind of ultra-urban co-living strategy. Now, we don't just restrict ourselves to converting existing buildings. We do have other brownfield sites that are part of that strategy as well. We have an amazing site in Elephant and Castle. It's the last plot as part of the Lend-Lease development. We're doing that development with HIG. Again, that's ultra urban location, London Zone 1, great amenity, but it's a new build. So we look at there's I'm talking about 2 strategies. One is kind of ultra urban location that applies to converting buildings, but also new build, and then our kind of repurposing strategy is solely focusing on the stranded assets and turning them into living.
We've spoken a bit about the strategy, the assets, Hub's involvement in the life cycle of developing and delivering these assets. What we haven't spoken about is your rise from development manager to managing director at Hub. Talk to me about that evolution in terms of also the team size and growth and business growth as you've kind of plotted the journey in terms of the different projects and partners you've worked with.
Yeah, sure. So, from being an assistant development manager 11 years ago to being appointed managing director 6 years ago. So I actually moved from assistant DM to MD in 5 years, which was a rapid rise through the business. I was quite fortunate. Luck played a bit of a part. We had a really great business. We had really great co-founders. We had really good joint venture partners. I mentioned Bridges Fund Management. We're about to do our 15th deal with them. 15th deal with Bridges in the coming months. We've Smedvig, Red Eagle, HIG. We're fortunate we have good partners. Because we were a small team, I was able to get exposure to those partners at a really kind of young age and early in my career. And that certainly helped to build the relationships, but also build trust with them. So very quickly, I got promoted to development manager, senior development manager. Then I was associate director. A bit of it was because, the necessity within the business to grow the team, but also our CEO, Robert, was a great promoter of young people, but young people who he believes in, who he thinks has got something about them that's going to make them integral to the business, and ultimately be a leader in the business. So I very much had, our founders backing to be promoted. And I ended up, 6 years ago being promoted to managing director. It was a little bit daunting at the time. Obviously you have that period of where you're like, this is amazing. I'm MD, and I'm 34 years old. And then the next week you're like, now I've got to do it. And after I was promoted to MD, I obviously spent time with our founders, spent a lot of time with Robert, our CEO, talking about what's the risks to the business, what's the opportunity, where do we go next? And we had great ideas, and thankfully we've been able to implement them. But one of the key things stood out was our team. At that point we were still a relatively small team doing big projects.
And how did you split it? Was it a case of you had a transaction or a front-end team, a bit more of a delivery team? And did you get exposure through those different parts to round your skill set as well?
At the beginning, I had exposure to everything because we're a small team. I was in the acquisitions meetings, I was in the finance meetings, I was in the development meetings. And the projects I would run, you would do everything. yourself. Whereas we knew as the business grew and the number of investors we work with grew and the scale of what we did, we had to split the business into different teams. Split's a dangerous word because we're still one team, but we have people focused on different strategies. So within Hub, very quickly, we built an acquisition team. That's part of the business generation team. So back then, that was all part of a strategy for moving forward. We had to have a head of acquisitions, we had to have a head of investor relations, we had to have a head of marketing. We were bringing in people to head up those departments. But when I was winding back to when I was made managing director, that was all part of the strategy. What is the 5-year vision? Well, first one was, what is the 6-month vision, year, 5-year? What do we want to achieve? And we always had that debate about value versus values. And I think we still do today. Ultimately, we need to create value. We need to make money for our investors and we need to make money for us as a business. But we also wanted to stick to our core values because we built a really good reputation for doing things the right way. And I think what's been really kind of key to me and what I've been really passionate about from a very young age back in Ireland, but when I joined Hub was, how can we be a developer that's respected? We're professional. We still lead by example, but we don't have the old-fashioned developer mindset, which is, I'm the most important person around the table, so I'll shout the loudest and I'll bang the table and I'll get my way. We don't tolerate that now. We didn't want to be that sort of developer. So my view was, you employ very smart people. The people within your team needs to have more knowledge than anyone else around that table. They need to understand the detail. They can't just take a big picture view and demand that their M&E engineer solves it or their architect solves it. So how are we going to do that? The way to do that was we would build a development team within Hub that was made up of really good professionals. That was influenced a bit by myself. Obviously, I joined as an architect, and we decided to bring in architects, planners, engineers, surveyors. So we've built the development team, not the traditional way. We built it. Some people we worked with, we thought were really good. They joined us. Others was recommendations. And eventually today, thankfully, we're in a position where people come to us and say, you're the developer who employs really good consultants. Can I come and join? But by doing that, we were able to create a really talented team with different backgrounds and create a combined skill set. So within our office, we know about everything. Like one individual won't, but the combination of that team means all bases are covered. We also are very keen to create a culture within our business, which is one of a mindset of a business owner. And that's really important because when you're out there making decisions, if you think like a business owner, you're more likely to make decisions that create value. And I think we achieved that very quickly, in the last 5 or 6 years, and we're definitely achieving that today. Our bigger challenge going forward is how we maintain that. How do we make sure that we're creating value and balancing that with our values?
How do you give your team agency to think like a business owner?
It's a very good question. So for long-term members of staff within the Hub business, we have things like EMI. So people become or can become shareholders in time within the business. And for someone to know that they've got an interest in that business, in that project, it completely changes the mindset. Or even the knowledge knowing they may get that in the future. It's not a business that's there and it hides, everything's hidden away from the team. We work in an open plan office. We're very open with the team. People know what's happening on each of the projects. They know how the business is run. We're transparent with decision making. And that alone creates a really positive culture within the business because our assistant development managers today or our assistant acquisition managers today just love that insight. They don't have to go through 3 layers of management to talk to me or talk to Robert. They have the opportunity to just come and talk to us. So I think we've struck it at the minute. We have a really nice balance between being a big business with a big team, but still retaining the qualities of when I joined Hub 11 years ago. And yeah, that's getting harder to maintain that. But, culture is so important. And ultimately that reaps rewards when people go out there. Simple things. We don't hire project managers in our projects. I get asked all the time, why don't you hire project managers? And it's really simple because I want our team to be empowered to make the decisions. We don't want a project manager there who quite often becomes a post box or quite often is influencing decision. We want our development managers to be the project manager, be the design manager, and ultimately feel empowered to make informed decisions. And informed decisions is really important. That goes back to my point about you need to be the person around the table who knows the most about that project. Then you make good decisions. And I never have an issue if someone makes a mistake, as long as at the time the decision was well considered, thought through, and then if we make a mistake, we can roll back. What we don't want is people making knee-jerk reactions. And that goes back again to kind of employing people at a young age and you kind of relatively early in their careers. And then within our business, we can mold them. We're fortunate now. We have a head of development, a head of acquisitions, 3 development directors. We have a senior team there that we're all joined Hub at a relatively young age, and they've grown within those roles. So they kind of understand the basics of how we operate as a business, and they all have our values in abundance.
Yeah. It's one thing saying, go and make your best informed decision. The other is doing it in the Hub way, right? And is that where the kind of the people, planet, progress framework wraps around and sets some parameters or boundaries to enable people to make those decisions based on what is expected of them?
Yeah, no, it is. Like I get asked quite often by junior members of staff, what is the Hub way? And one asked me, could I send them the booklet of the Hub way? A lot of it will come back to my way. And I don't mean that to sound arrogant, but it's a way of, when Catherine from Thriving was on, I listened
Catherine
to
Webster.
Yeah, Catherine Webster. And she made a comment on this podcast about you need to understand every single word in your legal document. I resonate with that so much. Like when I talk about the Hub ways, you understand those documents inside out. You don't think the lawyer did it so it's right, or the contractor did it so it's right. So that my view of the Hub way is it's just understanding that project, understanding the legal documents. If you don't understand it, ask questions. But also the Hub way is doing it in a professional way. We have one of our development directors, I won't name him to embarrass him, but I recently had feedback from some of our professional team, and I felt really proud when they said it. They were like, he's the only development director we work with that always gets his way, but never raises his voice. And I asked, how does he do that? And they're like, he's really firm, but he backs up everything he's saying with knowledge, and he's transparent in the whole development process. So if he's asking for value engineering, he's explaining why, he's talking them through the appraisal. And I think that's a great summary of, how we should be perceived as a business externally. Yep. And it's really important, that professionalism and that way of getting results. And we often get asked, how come you're doing so many deals? How can you do things so quickly? How can you do so much with, the size of the team? But I think we're surrounding ourselves by really great professionals, but we're managing them in a really good way that they want to work with us. Obviously, we pay them on time, all the basics. But at the end of the day, we're dealing with human beings, and we have to show them respect. And we can't achieve anything on our own without the hundreds, quite often thousands of people that work on our project by the time we get one built and finished.
Yeah, another client of ours describes it as being like trusting, but like really thorough as well. Yeah. And knowing and setting that dynamic, and people being expecting of that is a way of it being able to perpetuate across culture, and people knowing what they're getting involved with, whether they're funding projects or they're going to be laying the bricks and actually delivering it. There's a lot of challenges in the market at the moment, specifically within the living space. Gateway 2, building safety, build cost inflation, cost of land. Is debt accretive or not? And a whole host of other bits. What's your take, and what's the biggest challenging? a challenge facing you and the wider team at Hub at the moment?
Everything you said is right. It is very challenging out there at the moment. But the Hub mindset is where there's a challenge, there's also an opportunity, and we look to flip some of these challenges on its head. But I did get asked recently on a panel session if I was Angela Rayner for one day, what would it change? Obviously, I had a long list, but just to focus on one, probably the Building Safety Act is our biggest obstacle right now. We're a developer, obviously, of living, but we deliver at scale, so we deliver large schemes, and we have a piece of legislation in place now that we can't really quantify. So when we're buying new sites, how long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost? How does it affect the funding market? Yeah, we have ideas, but you're looking into a crystal ball to an extent. The projects we're trying to get on site, and what is very frustrating is projects that we have funding for and we can start. We've got good consents, good schemes, good locations and funding, and we can't start building them. That's slightly infuriating, because all the other challenges that you summarize so well, we've overcome one way or another. Viability, debt, the kind of sentiment in the market, the renters' rights bill, we're overcoming them. Don't get me wrong, when you combine them all, it's a big challenge. But if I had to choose one right now, and I might change my answer this time next year, it would be the Building Safety Act. It would unlock at least 1,400 homes within the Hub business alone this year. And, that's just us. There's some frightening stats out there. Salves have done a piece of research where they say there's 800 high-rise schemes delayed because of the Building Safety Act. That could be 150 to 200,000 homes delayed. So we do need to see reform. But rather than, Hub's view is we just don't moan about it. We need to find solutions. So we're very much involved in that, lobbying for change, but explaining why change is needed. We're looking at research around the world. We're looking at what happened in Ireland, not just because I'm from there, but they went through a very similar system with the Building Safety Act in 2014-15, same issues. They reformed it slightly. It's working perfectly today. The building warrant system in Scotland, another really good example of where you get the same result, but it's a system that's well resourced, it's phased. We know how to factor in timing, we know how much it costs. So we do need to see some change in it, and we need to see it quickly. But it's not stopping us getting on with things. It's just delaying us. There's still a desperate need for housing. The fundamentals are there. We do have a pro-development government. We have very, very ambitious housing targets. Let's be honest, they're unrealistic. But we don't mind that, because it's good to have aggressive housing targets so that we're aiming for something high. But we're also starting to see lots of changes at planning level. I've been in meetings, pre-apps recently, where previously the local authority would have never said, come up at the end and ask me, what's delaying this project? Can we help? I think we're starting to see the influence of central government down to the GLA, down to local authorities. There's a desperate need for housing, and we need to remove some of the barriers. So I've got to give credit, at national and local level, we are seeing changes in planning. But we don't want to end up with all our schemes just with planning consent. At Hub, we don't sell sites, we build our schemes out. And so we do need to see some change. But us as an industry, we're having to change as well. Going back to our earlier conversation about institutional forward funding, we're looking at different ways of funding. And quite often that means we're staying in our projects longer, which creates an opportunity, because within the Hub business, we never had an asset management role.
So rather than exiting a business, you just refinance it and then kind of manage it on a more of an evergreen type basis.
At least in the short term. I'll give you a good example. So we, I don't know if you noticed, in the press yesterday, it was announced we signed a joint venture housing growth partnership for a 604-bed PBSA scheme in Edinburgh. It's the biggest PBSA scheme in the city on one side. And that scheme is we're going to be asset managing that until at least stabilisation. So it's a really good example how being flexible on the funding allows us to deliver, but also creates opportunity for Hub and Bridges Fund Management in that, our ability to asset manage that, add more value through that, create another side to the business. So you've got to embrace some of these challenges. I think also, one of the positives right now with viability challenges and the Building Safety Act is we're seeing the best, the kind of cream rise to the top. A lot of developers that are looking to cut corners, do things cheaply, do things quickly, they won't survive in the market we're in today. So I think you're going to end up with the really good developers rising to the top. That institutional model just wanting to back the good developers. So I think there's an advantage at this time of, we're seeing it, lots of the institutional funders, lots of partners coming to us and wanting to work with us because of our track record, but also they have the faith in our ability to overcome the challenges, the Building Safety Act, the Renters' Rights Bill, and they have faith that, we can move on our business to asset manage some of our buildings. And I think on the multifamily, we're seeing, move away from the traditional forward funding to a more structured deal, where more of that balance in payment is dependent on rental performance. So again, there's an asset management role there. And I think as a development sector and as a business, if you believe in your product, you shouldn't be intimidated or scared by that. So we're going through a period of change, but it always feels like there's something. I was talking to one of our institutional funders and last week, and she was saying to me, I asked her about the Renters' Rights Bill, and she goes, it's just another thing, isn't it? Building safe. But they always got something. But the fundamentals there, we still need lots of housing.
Part of the course of being a developer, right? And a development manager, being a social chameleon, to your point earlier of having to go and deal with 40 skips that get turned up on site on one hand, and then going and presenting or talking to kind of capital partners, a couple of hours later.
Exactly.
So there'll always be something thrown at you for you to navigate. What are you most excited about right now?
I'm most excited about our repurposing strategy. I think we came up with the idea 2 years ago. We've now got the assets. We've got planning on one. We're about to get planning another today, tomorrow. And then we've just acquired the third site as part of that strategy. I'm most excited to see those delivered. I think they're in phenomenal locations. I think they're so unique. And I think we're gonna prove that these are going to let really well. They're going to let really quickly, and ultimately they're going to generate hopefully a lot of value for us and our partners. That excites me. Going back to I think how I started this obsession with how things are built. We've got all the ingredients there. We now need to build it, and there's nothing more satisfying than finishing a building. That day people move in and see, and quite often 7, 8, 9 years of work, and all the roller coaster journey along the way. So yeah, that's very exciting. But also I'm excited for, the next 10 years within Hub. We've had an amazing 13-year journey. I've been part of it for 11 years. We're to a degree only getting going. So I'm quite excited about what comes next for Hub, as we continue to grow our living business. But also, what's next for multifamily built to rent? Yeah, it's quiet now, but what is the third or fourth generation? I have my views. I think we're going back to a mid-market product, light amenity schemes and good transport connections because of affordability issues. But all of that excites me. Like we don't stand still. And that's so important at Hub. We're always looking at what happens next year and what happens the year after. And that has served us so well. And we're continuing to do that. And yeah, sometimes we're not right, but more often than not we are.
Is there a move into senior living, care, hotels, or student accommodation?
I think student accommodation is something, we're not a developer that just gets into something for the sake of getting into it. We want to have a deep understanding of it. There's people out there that understands later living, senior living extremely well. We may go into it in the future, but our view of getting into co-living was slow, and now we're heavily in it. PBSA, we've got 2 schemes. Our first scheme has started on site, I touched on earlier. So we will grow that PBSA side of it, but we're not going to just rush into it. We're very much experts and have a track record in multifamily and co-living. PBSA will probably come next. We often talk about single family. Single family is obviously a sector that's growing rapidly, and it's something at Hub that we may look at in the future.
Damien, as we look to draw this to a close, a question I ask everyone who comes on the podcast is, if I gave you £500 million worth of capital, how would you allocate it?
Good question. I would allocate it, slightly boring answer, but I'd definitely look at a repurposing strategy.
Thought you'd say that.
But looking at something we're not doing at the minute would be single family. I feel there's an opportunity there. Single family, there's huge demand for it. Institutional funders desperately want to get into it, but at the minute it's very much propped up by house builder stock. So that's stock that house builders can't sell because the sales market isn't there right now. So I feel like there's an opportunity, actually a little bit like when Hub got into build to rent 10, 11 years ago, to look at actually designing a product that is specifically for the single family market. So I think that's a sector that I would look to invest a substantial amount of that money in. And another thing, we do a lot with social impact funding and bridges fund management, just looking at a solution to the affordability crisis. And we hear from local authorities all the time the amount of interest they're spending on temporary accommodation. It's shocking, and it's shocking the standards people have to live in. And there's got to be a business model there to provide proper housing, so we don't need temporary housing. So I think I would like to look at a solution, and potentially an institutional funded solution, given the amount of money that local authorities haven't spent just to service the debt on it alone.
Is there an international expansion on the cards?
Good question. We do look, it's a little bit like when Hub expanded out of London and we identified our 5 lifestyle cities. We do talk about other cities around Europe. And we've looked at 1 or 2 in a little bit of detail, but not in the short term. We have a lot to focus on here in the UK at the moment.
Is in 10 years' time, when Hub has achieved hundreds or tens of schemes more than what you've done at the moment, is there a career box that 11, 14, 24-year-old Damien wants to then move from kind of developer side to the capital allocator side to kind of square the circle?
A good question. I see myself, I'm still relatively young, so I see myself in my current role and kind of spearheading Hub alongside the co-founders of the business for the next decade or 2. But at some point, I would probably like to take more of an overview again, whether that's a non-exec role but we're talking in 15, 20, 25 years time. But my passion for real estate, I'll always be there. I still love the job, whether that's still doing my own little properties and going on a Saturday and hanging a door, or it's structuring a forward funding deal at Hub. I still have a passion for building, structuring deals and real estate in general. And I don't anticipate that changing at any point in the future.
Damien, fascinating background, story, career, and get the sense you and the team are just getting started. So thank you so much for joining me today, and excited to see what you guys are going to build and deliver and how you navigate the many challenges and flip them into opportunities moving forward.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Hey, quick one from me. If you enjoyed this conversation, do me a favor and share it with a friend or colleague that you think would get value from this conversation. It would mean the world and help grow the People Property Place podcast. Thank you so much.